everybody. Welcome to week 6 of English 1133. This week we're going to start on paper 3. That will be your main project for week 6, 7, and 8. So I'll walk you through that. I'm also going to talk some about finding sources and using them in your paper. That will be a new feature we'll get to in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to switch over to the lecture notes. Okay. So before we get to the meat on paper 3, just a few housekeeping things to keep you aware of. We do have a final exam in this course. It is set up as a regular quiz. Please refer to my email that I sent September 26th. That goes through the format for the exam as well as some of the content, the topics covered. I'm going to touch on one of those topics, that is how to use sources and kind of recognize them later today. But you will also need to go back over stuff like grammar, the writing process, stuff like that. It's a reasonably difficult exam because it does cover everything there. So we might touch base on that again a little bit later in the quarter, but I want you to put that on your radar screen. The revision of paper 2, you recall the deadline was moved to September 28th, Monday. So most of those papers have just come in. I will be getting to that feedback over the next several days. I'm actually starting a new class on Thursday, so it'll be a little bit busier this next couple of weeks than usual, but do my best to keep up the grading. And then on week 7, we're jumping ahead a little bit, you have an extra credit assignment, but you can actually do it at any time. So the assignment is to download the software called Zotero. I've linked you to the set of instructions here in the notes. You can also go to week 7 and pull that up. And you can actually kind of kill two birds with one stone here. So one of your assignments for week 6 is called sources, and that is finding 2 sources to use in paper 3, and I will talk you through that in a few minutes as well. I recommend that you go ahead and install Zotero. It's kind of annoying, but it's very useful once you get started. So set aside some time for that. The extra credit assignment is, I think, 20 points. It comes out to about 2% of your course grade, so it can definitely help, especially if you've had some trouble with the quizzes or other smaller assignments. And all you have to do to earn credit for that is turn in the bibliography in the correct format and maybe give me a screenshot or something to show that you use Zotero to generate it. It does actually save you a lot of time in the long run. So I want you to be aware of that as well. Let's talk about paper 3. This is a personal essay. So it's still in academic format, so you're going to use a thesis and all that fun stuff. But it's a different approach. So in this one, you're going to describe your philosophy of writing as a Christian. In your thesis, the claim you want to kind of address, or the claim you want to make, should address this question: what difference does your faith make in how you approach, understand, and perform writing tasks and assignments? So you can write about a lot of different individual things here. Some suggestions from the assignment: purpose, meaning, the process itself, maybe the effects, other elements. Why do you write? What difference does this make? And the reason that we're doing this last is because you've been writing about a lot of similar topics for the past several weeks, especially in your discussion posts. So I want you to focus this paper on writing, and let's say in an academic or professional context. I realize that for most of you, this is your first college writing class ever, and you may not do a whole lot more academic writing once you graduate. That's fine. But you will be doing a lot of writing. So you might think about this not just in terms of how do I write papers well in the classroom, but how do I write well in the field or the type of ministry or whatever it is that I want to pursue professionally. So that's where I'd like you to focus. Some of you may be more on the creative writing end of things, and that could be songwriting or poetry or fiction. You're welcome to bring in a couple examples of that, but I don't want it to kind of take over the whole essay. Overall, show how your faith informs and influences your writing process. So anything that you've written this quarter is fair game, both in terms of examples and in terms of sometimes actual content. The discussion posts are going to be most useful from weeks 1, 2, 3, and 7. That's when you kind of engage these questions most directly. So go back to those discussion forums. You should have access to all of them. Read what you wrote, and also read your classmates' posts, not the responses in their main posts, because maybe they'll get you thinking about, oh yeah, that's something I could talk about in my own writing. In terms of the formatting, this will be excuse me, a little bit longer. Your rough draft, it needs to be at least 1,000 words long. So before, we've been dealing with that 900 to 1,200 word range. MyFire does not define a maximum length. When I'm going to set it at 2,000 words, I don't think you'll need more than that. If you really want to go over 2,000, let's talk about it. There might be some ways to make that work, but we also have the final exam to think about, and I'm sure you got other stuff to deal with in the next couple of weeks. So aim for that 1,000 or 2,000 spot. If it helps you plan at 1,500 or so and work on the outline for that. It will definitely help to outline what you want to accomplish, what examples you want to give, and we can talk through individual ideas for that in office hours or during our live sessions for SU Ohio. I'm going to be putting up a couple of sample papers on the announcements section, and if you go to the week 8 supplemental resources, there is a sample paper posted there as well. So take a look at those to get a sense of what is useful for an assignment like this. I will kind of caution you, the requirements for this assignment did recently change. They redid the whole curriculum. So you might not see everything exactly matching up to the course rubric. Obviously, you want to follow the instructions here to make those supersede anything that you see in the samples. Now, the big difference between this and previous papers is that you're going to be finding and using 2 outside sources. For this paper, you can use non-academic sources. When you get into English 1233 and do more research there, then we're going to be focusing more on academic research and academic sources. But the idea is using a couple sources here that are related clearly in some way to your argument or your content. So if you are a songwriter by trade and you want to write about what does it mean to write songs as a Christian, then maybe a couple of blog posts or a couple of podcasts might be appropriate for that. I say that because this is a topic, philosophy of writing is not going to get a lot of useful hits on an academic search engine or something like Google Scholar, library databases. You can learn how to use those a little bit better in the library videos you'll be watching for this week. But honestly, I found the most use out of regular Google and some other sources that I had bookmarked as well. So I put a set of links up. I don't know, they're like 20 or 25 links. Some of them are to blog sites. There are a couple of a series of blog posts that I think would be helpful there. You can browse through those. Some of them are individual essays, and they go all over the place. One is from a bookstore, a Christian bookstore, that posts a lot about book reviews and reading and kind of thinking through that. And then there's also an article on Harry Potter and Jesus, so that might be a fun one to look at as well. It really depends on how you want to approach this. One other resource to keep in mind, in week 7, your discussion post will be about a podcast on Christian writing, Jeff Goins. That is fair game for a source. So if you want to get a jump on that, listen to the podcast. You can use that as one of your sources to kind of make it pay off for the extra time you're putting in for that project. So those are the basic outlines. You can, of course, refer to MyFire for other details and other instructions, and we can talk about that as needed. Here's the timeline for this assignment. As with paper 2, there are several assignments kind of in this project cluster. First, on Saturday, October 3rd, so this is week 6, your sources assignment is due. The idea is that you will find 2 potential sources early before you actually do most of the drafting. That encourages you to start thinking early about how you're going to put that together. Use the videos to find sources. I'll also be going over some strategies in today's lecture. And what you need for that assignment is a bibliography if you're using Chicago, or references page if you're using APA for both sources. But unlike traditional bibliographies, you're also going to include a brief summary of each one. So 2 or 3 sentences, what does it argue? What is the content? That kind of stuff there. If you want to go ahead and use Zotero for this one, as I said, a picture or a screenshot, I'll give you the extra credit for that, and that way you don't have to worry about it in week 7 as well. The first big deadline will be Tuesday, October 6th, so the end of week 6. That is your rough draft, 1,000 words, and so that means take a look at your schedule, especially for this week, and find work sessions. If you are doing 5 of them, that's only 200 words. That's a paragraph, maybe a paragraph and a half each day. I think that's doable. But you will need to set aside considerably more time because you're writing in bigger chunks than you have for the previous 2 papers. In some ways, it'll be a little bit easier because you're writing from personal experience, but you're still forming argument. So this will be a more difficult project overall. I want to make sure you give yourself enough time and kind of have a realistic sense of how much effort will go into that at the outset here. Our next deadline will be on Thursday, October 8th. This is a pretty straightforward assignment. It is a self-review. So it's the same principle as the peer review worksheet you did in week 4, I think. It was week 6. One of those weeks. It was at some point in this quarter. As then, you're going to download the worksheet, and that is actually held in week 7 under Apply. And it's kind of like a checklist. You go through, evaluate the work that you've done, and it asks stuff like, what is your thesis claim? Can you easily locate it? What evidence do you cite? That kind of stuff. I think it's helpful to actually read that thing first because it gives you a sense of what to plan for as you develop the draft. So at the same time you are grading yourself, so to speak, I will be grading the rough drafts going throughout week 7, so you have time to get everything ready because our final deadline for this will be Saturday, October 17th. That is in week 8. And the revised draft is due at 11:59 that day. Now here's the good news. It is the same assignment as the first draft. So we're none of this new content or change from 2 to 1 sources or anything like that, like I did with paper 2. All you have to worry about is addressing any feedback that I gave you and anything you noticed in your self-review. Maybe you've started a couple examples but you didn't have time to fully develop them in the rough draft. Maybe you come up with more stuff that you could talk about. Maybe I have some ideas. I'll just have to see how the individual drafts go. So if you are able to put in the work and the planning into the rough draft stage in week 6, you can save yourself a lot of time in week 8. And we can, I would encourage you to make this the week or the next week, where you come by office hours or you email those questions or you find some way to talk to a classmate and say, hey, can we look at this because I think I'm not quite sure how to do this. This is a major paper and I know everything is getting busy, so I want to make sure that we have some time for this. To that end, I want to spend the rest of today's lecture talking about sources. Since this is not a research paper in the traditional sense of find 5 to 300 sources and write about each one of them, make sure you quote all of them, it's going to look a little bit different. And when you come back for 1233, then we'll have more time to talk about the research process. But I do want to give you some advice on finding those sources, evaluating what you have found, seeing if it's actually going to be useful, and then actually integrating that. So thinking about how do I use these sources and what does that show me about their role in my argument. So research process, I think I might have shown you this at one point before, but it's complicated. And I like this graphic partly because of this point here. Make it something that interests you. Hopefully, you're able to connect the way you approach writing to something in your life that is important. Um, Maybe that's not fully academic writing, but maybe you think I really want to learn more about this field, or I want to be able to write better in this context, or I want to write better to this audience. All of that is fair game to talk about in this paper. In fact, I do a version of this when I teach this a course like this at different universities. I will tell them for the research paper, write about something that makes a difference in your everyday life. And if you have that sort of flexibility in topic, I think it's a really great approach, because the number one danger in research papers is burnout. You get a little ways in, and suddenly you realize, I hate this topic. I don't want to know anything more about it ever for the rest of my life, period. And why do I have to keep writing 5 to 6 more pages on it? And that's usually where students either give up and try to just fill the space with whatever they can. Sometimes they choose to plagiarize other material. Sometimes they just stop turning in papers. It's not a good result. So I encourage you to plan carefully, not just in the middle of your paper as you're actually drafting it, but before you start. Think about, how can I connect this to what I already know, what I already like, maybe something that is important to me in other parts of my life. As I suggested on your very first day of class, stay engaged in your own learning. From there, the specific strategies will differ depending on what kind of research you're doing and what kind of resources you have available. For example, you can gather information, which is up to the library that is you're looking at, from a lot of different places. And each of these kinds of sources will call for different strategies. As you become more experienced researchers, you'll learn more about research in your area, research with a particular tool, a particular database. But you got to find the stuff. So I'm going to be touching on some of the materials in here, thinking about keywords. I'm not going to worry so much about the topics or the thesis, because we've gone over some of that before, and it's really more suited for a longer research paper. But I'll be going over how do you actually find useful keywords, as well as how do you evaluate the resources that you have. How do you bring them in some useful way for your paper? Because you could spend hours and hours and hours poking through databases and websites and these things we used to have in the before time called libraries with actual books. I know, it was a strange, strange time. And come out the other end really not sure how any of that is going to help you add a single word to your paper. And that's not a good feeling. So I want to make this as practical as I can. Let me start by looking at search keywords thing. To form good keywords, you need to know something about what the paper is going to look like. Now, you may not know the specific content yet, but you'll be able to figure out what sort of questions to ask, and maybe you have to do some free writing or some other brainstorming activities first. I would recommend starting with the big topic. If you think big, often that actually helps a lot more when you're trying to find individual sources. So the stuff I posted on MyFire, most of those sources were most of those searches were some variant of Christianity and writing, which are two massively impossible topics to cover in a 1,000-word paper. But they got me to a starting point, and then I was able to think, what kind of stuff shows up here? What's going to be potentially useful? I started to browse individual sources and say, okay, this is definitely related to this topic. This one, not so much. So if you start big, then you can start educating yourself on your topic. Because here's the thing, the best research starts from a position of ignorance. You don't know something, and so you've got to learn more about it. That works for education too, incidentally. Because if you try to research something you already know, then you're not really going to get very far, not really going to learn very much. So ask yourself, what do I want to know more about within this topic? And this is where you can also use general reading to your advantage. We've got a lot of information out on the web. And yes, Wikipedia occasionally, okay, reasonably often, has good information on a lot of different topics. So maybe you start by looking up your topic on Wikipedia, or maybe you came across it in a textbook or in a lecture or something like that and say, I need to know more about this. As you are deciding how to search for more information, it helps to pick up on the terms, the keywords that keep getting repeated. Here's an example. If my research question were, what is the relationship between playing board games and Alzheimer's disease, I could take my searches in a lot of different directions. Now, if I put that whole thing into Google, I might actually get a couple of decent results, only because people have actually researched this before at some length, and because, of course, I've run this search before in other classes. But it's not going to be as helpful to me because by default, Google and other search engines look for full text. So they want that whole quote right there. And maybe there are really useful articles that don't talk about that in those terms. So maybe the title of the article you really want to find is chess and dementia, but neither one of those is in the research question. So instead of just putting in the question itself, Google is not the computer from Star Trek, you need to think about concepts and ideas. Here are some for this one. If you've used Google at all, you know that sometimes you can get really strange and offbeat results if you have big, broad keywords. And that's a problem with any large database. It will show something that has nothing to do with what you're looking for, but it happens to share a keyword or something. So I could put in play, and I might get games people play by Joe South. I might get things for playtime for toddlers. I might get the plays the thing, an analysis of Hamlet. None of that is going to help me understand the relationship between playing board games and Alzheimer's disease. And it's even worse if I put in brain, because I could get a lot of stuff about neurology that I don't understand. I could get something about Pinky and the Brain, and then I'd be distracted for 3 hours while I watch old Pinky and the Brain cartoons. I could even get Google saying, do you mean Brian? No, Google, I don't mean Brian. So those two keywords by themselves are not going to be very helpful. But if I combine them with others, then I might start getting somewhere. I could try just board games, Alzheimer's. I probably put board games in quotes there. You can search the whole phrase. I could try board games and dementia. Alzheimer's and dementia are related diseases. I could even try board games, play, and brain and see what I come up with. Because maybe when I started this whole search process, I wasn't quite sure what brain diseases or conditions I was interested in, but I knew I wanted to write about board games. This is a reasonably well-developed research question. The same exercise can help you a lot in finding sources on your topic, not just in paper 3, but moving forward in your other classes. Think of concepts that you're researching and not just terms in your paper title or your specific question. So as you go, start with short terms, usually broad terms broad terms work best at first. As you learn more about how the sources in that field talk about these things, then you want to look for ways to combine them. Because ultimately you want to narrow it down to something that you can reasonably read through in a work session, or at least save them to read them later. Concrete terms work a lot better than abstract terms. So something like compare and relationship, not going to be very helpful unless it happens to occur in a title of a page or something. Those can come in later, but first you want to figure out what are the specific variables that are important. One way to do that is to think about synonyms for your keywords, so words that mean the same thing or similar things, I should say. And this is where you can honestly it can be as simple as going to thesaurus.com and plugging in a word, saying, okay, what are some other words that mean this thing? Let me try those. Maybe Google talks in that language. Especially as you use more specialized search engines, more specialized databases, you've got to speak their language. Poetry is going to give you different results than verse. And I'm not entirely sure why, because that seems like the same thing, poetry and verse. But there are some databases that index different articles differently. An index works like a hashtag. So if you do hashtag poetry on Twitter, but if you have to go to Twitter, you do hashtag poetry, you're going to get different results than hashtag verse. Another thing to watch for is abbreviations. This is especially important in scholarly research because scholars like to use really, really big words. That's how you know we're scholars, because we swore an oath not to use anything as short as a or word. I used it again. To fit everything in the article, or especially in the title, we use abbreviations. Some of them make their way to other fields, or you might run into them in daily life. So you've probably seen ESL, meaning English as a second language. But maybe you haven't run across, unless you've researched education, EFL, English as a foreign language, or L2 for second language, or all the other fun little abbreviations that they use. This is part of gaining expertise in your discourse community. Aha, we came back to it. Because you learn the terms, and you know that they are going to be helpful not only in identifying certain concepts, but in finding more material on those ideas. From there, you need to think about how to structure your searches. This is going to be a search process. You're almost never going to find exactly what you need the first time through. As you move between search engines, there are going to be different keyword combinations I mentioned earlier. And this is because search engines are basically stupid. They know how to operate within the parameters in which they're programmed. And so if you say, hey, search engine, I want you to catalog only the books on my shelves. I have 3 bookshelves here, and it's a rather small collection compared to something like, say, the Library of Congress, but they have a lot more shelf space than I do. Then you get pretty good results if you search for Great Expectations or Moby Dick. I know I've got copies of those. But there are a lot of books I don't have, or there are books that I have, but I have maybe in an ebook format. So if my database is only looking for the physical books on that shelf, then it's going to be a very limited use to someone trying to find the collected works of James Fenimore Cooper, which are not really represented very well, if at all, on my shelves. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, longer search queries are giving you fewer results. Now, that can be a good thing towards the end of your search process because it narrows it down. It can be a very frustrating thing towards the beginning because you probably don't know exactly what you're looking for yet. So that's why I recommend starting with short queries and finding ways to narrow them down based on more precise language rather than trying to throw everything into that whole query. The good news is that there are some very useful database tools out there. So this will depend on the engine you're using, but you can use some of the built-in limiters or filters and say, I only want stuff that was published after 2000, or I only want PDF sources, full text sources, or I only want stuff in German. This is very useful because the larger your database, the more likely you are to get junk in your searches. I have done sample searches, kind of in live demonstrations to students, and some random stuff in Turkish or Hungarian will show up. I don't know why exactly it came up for my search terms, but obviously it's not very helpful to me if I can't read those languages. So you can limit those. You can also use Boolean operators. That's Boolean. If you want to research that, there's a whole bunch of complicated stuff to work with there. That can help you a lot in telling Google what terms to ignore and what terms to make sure you have to include. So maybe you're doing your search for brain and you thought, okay, Animaniacs was awesome, but I don't want any more results involving Pinky in the brain. So I might say plus brain minus Pinky. Nothing with Pinky in it, just stuff with brain. Finally, please bookmark stuff. You have essentially unlimited storage when it comes to bookmarks. And even if for some reason you run out of that or you're not on your computer, you can't bookmark it, you can copy and paste something into a folder or a Word document or do something to keep track of it. Because if it looks like you might use it or you might want to come back to it, it's much better to have it and not need it later than to need it later and not have it. I can't tell you how many students I've had who come into class when we're doing a research workshop and say, oh, I found this really great source the other day. It was on, I think, page 7 of the Google results. And let's see, was I looking for motorcycles and watermelons or watermelons and motorcycles? Or was that search on Pepe Le Pew? I don't really remember. I'm sure I can find it again. Let me try that. And they never find it. They just don't. So internet history is occasionally useful in finding stuff, but once you get to an individual source, print it, save it, bookmark it, whatever you need to do so you have it there. And you will thank your past self later when you're actually trying to do your bibliography. Incidentally, if you do this with Zotero, it will save it in a database for you and instantly generate citations in the style of your choice. So you can have an ongoing database of, let's say, modest 500 sources on something you may want, you're interested in. Hopefully you're interested in it if you have 500 sources on it. But you're not going to use all 500 in one paper. We'll come back to that a little bit later. My browser bookmarks are ridiculously large and unorganized. I keep meaning to go back and reorganize everything, but then I get distracted by reading the bookmarks and I never get to it. Which is a good transition to talk about organizing the sources that you have. As you are doing research for a particular project, I recommend that you keep your notes together. If you like to take notes on paper, use a binder or a folder or a notebook of some sort. My wife loves taking notes, especially during meetings. She's in meetings most of her workday. And so she just has a spiral notebook and is constantly jotting down all these things about who to email about this and what's the bigger here and what do we need to follow up on there, especially when she has a meeting agenda. She'll just mark the whole thing up. I'm not so much a note taker, but I do organize my stuff on my computer or on Dropbox. So I have folders and folders of stuff from old research projects, of articles that I thought would be helpful or maybe that I cited in a paper or something, wanted to make sure I had them there. The other thing I would suggest is when you download something, rename the file to be something useful. Like author and title can be helpful, or even just the subject of the thing you're looking for. because when you download a file from a database, it's probably going to be a string of numbers in the file name, and that's not going to be helpful for you. Some tools, I mentioned Zotero, EasyBib, and similar sites can also be helpful to keep online bibliographies, and those are getting more sophisticated. There are plugins for various browsers. Google Scholar has its own plugin, so you can really automate a lot of this process. I have many clients who will keep coming back to the same sources in multiple articles because they're writing about similar topics, and they have to use stuff like this. More sophisticated versions of this are EndNote, RefWorks. I'm not 100% sure if our library has those because they're expensive, but they can do a whole lot to help you find and track sources. I like keeping stuff digitally if I can. So if I do have paper notes or documentation or something, I generally will take photos or scan them. At one point, people actually had flatbed scanners. They're not so much in existence anymore, but some of the printers have all-in-ones. Their scanners built in. I use my phone. So the Google Drive app has a built-in scanner. And whenever I need to print and sign a document and email to someone, which happens fairly often with contracts, or I'm working with my TAs right now for my other class, and they have all sorts of paperwork for me to fill out. I just use that, upload it to Google Drive, then I have a backup copy of it, and I can email it easily. Or you can just take pictures. I had a research trip several years ago. I was writing a chapter on the novel Ben-Hur, and I got to visit the author's original personal library and study. And I spent like 2 hours just sitting there and taking pictures of books that he had in his study, stuff he had read, little notes he wrote to himself, annotations. And it was great. This stuff is not available anywhere else. All it took for me was to sync that to Google Photos, and I have a permanent record of it. So I could go back at any point and use that to develop an argument and analysis of what this person actually wrote about when he was doing Ben-Hur. Great resource. So use the technology if you can. For the sources you're going to use quite a bit, I like to print them out, but I'm kind of old. Okay, I'm really old at this point compared to college. But I find that there's something about the tactile sensation of holding a piece of paper and holding an actual marker or highlighter, because you've all probably got a few of these old highlighters kicking around somewhere, and just saying, I want to remember this and this and this, because obviously, aren't you highlighting your Bible? You have to highlight your Bible. You're not a real Christian. Does anybody know that? I'm kidding. So you probably have them kicking around. This is a good way to isolate those quotes that you want to use in your paper, or the stuff you want to summarize or paraphrase. Remember that you need to use, summary, paraphrase, and quotes as you go through your arguments. So once you have your sources, then you have to decide what to do with them. And you need to evaluate not just do they relate to your topic, but are they going to be appropriate for the assignment that you're doing. So I'm going to start with the aspect of reliability. And one thing to keep in mind is that the sources that are in academic databases, such as Academic Search Complete, you may have come across before, Google Scholar to a limited extent, they go through professional peer review. And usually a lot more people look at that, a lot more experts evaluate that and say, well, here are the pluses, here are the minuses, here's what you should fix, compared to something like a Wikipedia article. Now, it doesn't mean that one type of source is automatically reliable and the other source is automatically not. But it means that you've got to think about who saw this and who read through this before I encountered it. Because if you haven't realized already, you can put anything you want on the internet. It doesn't have to be true, and some poor sap might find it, think, hey, that's kind of cool, I'm going to quote that in my paper. and then some weird misinformation is out in the world. You also want to keep in mind that we learn more details and we're able to better understand events and people and ideas the more historical distance we have from them. We have had, for example, roughly 2,000 years since the original publication of the Gospels. That's a lot of time to write commentaries, to do translations, to figure out what is the historical context here? What is this reference to? Does he really mean that it's easier to go for a camel to go through the eye of a needle? Because that's not happening. Conversely, if something has just happened, i.e. it's just in breaking news on Twitter or Facebook, we probably don't have a lot of reliable, specific information about it. Unfortunately, this doesn't stop people from reacting immediately and deciding what must have happened and who is to blame. And realizing that gives you some perspective on how to analyze different kinds of sources. Many news stories change and develop over the course of hours, let alone days and weeks and months. By the time you see an article in something like Google Scholar, it's probably been at least a year since it was written. In most cases, some stuff they rush to publication a little faster. If you find an article that has no citations at all, or all the citations are like from the 1950s, it's probably not a good source for you. Part of being a scholar in an area, part of being an expert, is to read and engage with what others have written. And if the author is not doing that, or decided I'm the only authority you ever need to know to trust for anything, my ethos is huge, then you probably shouldn't trust that source. A couple of references for you here. There's your checklist to help you evaluate your sources, one from the Modern Language Association, MLA style, and the other from a university library on source evaluation. I think our library may also have some pages on this as well. The second thing you want to evaluate in your sources is how relevant they are for your paper. So this is where it gets a little tricky. Your job is to use appropriate sources for the assignment, because you might have assignments where you say you can only use academic books or journal articles, or you can't use Google, or you can't use Wikipedia. That depends on the context and the professor. And the temptation is going to be to find easy sources, find stuff that mentions your topic in the title, or find something where you already agree with the source. You can just say, there, I have a source. I've also, though, run into students who will throw a source in they don't really understand, but it sounds really impressive because it uses big words and it was published in a scholarly journal. Neither of those situations actually helps you with your argument. This is your paper, and I want you to understand and apply these sources, not just cite them. Another thing to keep in mind here is that there are different kinds of secondary sources or outside sources. And they can help you clarify how each part of your argument is working, what's the purpose behind this paragraph or this section. So let's say you're taking Old Testament and you want to write about a particular passage in Judges. Well, there's a lot of scholarship on Judges as a book, and a lot of scholarship on the historical context, and on the literary context, and on the cultural context, and on all the contexts, and maybe some of the protexts, I'm not sure. But not all of them are going to be equally useful in different parts of your argument. So if your job is to analyze a particular chapter, but you also want to say, so this is kind of where it's coming from, this is what the author would have been thinking about or particularly referring to, you might want to start off with, here's some historical background. What do we know about the period when this judge ruled? What do we know about contemporary historical evidence? What do we know about from archaeology, for example? And that's going to help you set up your argument. But then once you move into your exegesis, your analysis, then you're going to bring in more scholarship on the text. And that might kind of touch on the history and the culture and everything like that. But it's most going to be, what do I actually see here? As you evaluate sources, keep in mind that not all of them are created equal. Not only in the sense that they're not all useful for a particular project, but they're not all persuasive. Because you know that some audiences are going to respond better to certain types of sources, certain types of evidence. Sometimes this is a bad thing. I definitely have friends who will not even consider reading an argument or accepting a fact if it is cited in anything besides Fox News, Breitbart, or Trump is awesome and probably God.com. I think I made the last one up, but I wouldn't surprise me. And so if I'm trying to persuade them of something, I have to realize that going in. More than once, just had to end a conversation because I'll say, well, no, actually, this is where I'm getting this source. Say, ugh. Yeah, of course they would say that, but it's fake news. And at that point, you don't really have a discussion. You kind of have to stop. Lastly, you want to think, how does this contribute to my paper? What is there that is unique? Could that be information you can't find anywhere else, a perspective, a viewpoint? Is there content there that is going to help you make your argument better? Because you got to be kind of selfish here. Why is this information helpful for me, for my paper? It could be a really cool argument on something completely irrelevant to what I'm doing. And that's one of the trade-offs of research. You're going to find a lot of cool stuff that you can't use. You're going to have to deal with it. And the third R for evaluating sources is rigor, because you have to have 3 R's, otherwise it doesn't count as a sermon. I mean, a PowerPoint presentation. Yes, PowerPoint presentation. So how do you evaluate the strength of the argument? Well, you've had some practice in this. You've been evaluating your peers' discussion posts, and you went through their summaries of Swale's article for one of your assignments, the peer review. Use what you've learned about argument here. Does this claim seem reasonable? Not, do you agree with it? Not, is it a good idea? Does it seem a reasonable claim given what you know of the context and the subject? Are they saying the sky is blue? Look, I have proven the sky is blue. To which your response should be, okay, so what? Are they saying the sky is definitely green? It's always green. It's never not been green. And by green, I mean pink. Maybe that's where you kind of back away. Or do they say the sky is definitely blue and anyone says otherwise a dirty liberal? Well, then you're probably reading Ben Shapiro. Evaluate this not just on the strength of whether you like it, whether it helps you, but is this a well put together argument? One sign of that is being open to counter arguments, sources that directly engage other people, other ideas, because you don't have to agree with your sources. Most academic articles do not agree with one or more of their major sources because they're saying, all right, this has been done, but I can do it better. This information is good, but we need to push it further. This viewpoint gives us a partial picture, but we need a fuller one. And you can do the same thing. You want to look for places in your source where you could agree, disagree, or do both at the same time. It's kind of a scary moment. When you're putting together a paper for English 1133, you realize there's this PhD out there, and I'm saying he's wrong about this. It'll pass. It's okay. Another way you can apply what you've learned is to evaluate the source rhetorically. So we looked last week at Rhetorical appeals, ethos, logos, pathos, and kairos. This is where you look at how does this function as an argument? What is going well? Where is it maybe a little bit weaker? Because that could be part of your analysis and part of whether you decide, is this a strong enough source to engage with to help me develop my own argument? Last topic I want to touch on today is how to use sources well. And I want to highlight a particular requirement in paper 3. That is, for the 2 outside sources you have, you need to have in your paper at least 1 direct quote, at least 1 paraphrase, and at least 1 summary. And if you want, you can do like 2 of those things from one source and 1 from the other. I would recommend bringing both sources in at some point to show that you've actually used them. But if it helps and you want to do just a checklist, you can just kind of go through, okay, source A, quote, paraphrase, summary, source B, quote, paraphrase, summary. I covered this in the week 3 lecture, so I want to go back to that lecture as well as the readings you did to refresh your memory on how those work. The other thing to remember here is that sources do a lot of work. They can, among other things, set up arguments. They can give you a starting point. They can prove that you understand a topic. I do a lot of that in dissertation. Show that I knew what is in this field and why is it important. They can obviously support a point that you're trying to make. They can establish a counter argument, maybe to your point, maybe giving you a point to offer their counter argument to their counter argument, and you go back and forth and back and forth. They can establish facts. But it can also have rhetorical effects. It can set a particular mood for the rest of your essay or song or speech or whatever it is. It can elicit emotions, pathos, in your readers or your audience. It can establish you as an authority, ethos. And I'm not just talking about when you cite a source in an academic paper. I want you to think how often, just in the past couple of days, you've heard someone refer to some outside evidence or some outside authority. How many sermons have you heard that quoted and cited the Bible? Well, hopefully all of them. If the answer is 0, you need to change your church. How many songs have you heard, Christian songs, that allude to or quote part of Psalms or the Gospels or Hillsong's First Greatest Hits album, which I don't think is canon quite yet. When you bring in a source, sometimes you bring in sort of the weight of it, the baggage, and that can have different rhetorical effects on your own argument. So your job is to move that argument forward in whatever form that citation takes. If you're quoting it directly, do something with the quote. If you're paraphrasing it, show how does this connect to what I'm saying. If you're summarizing it, maybe you can agree, disagree, or do both at once, as I suggested earlier. In this case, maybe you have heard a podcast or read a blog post or something like that, and you thought, that's kind of an interesting way to think about faith and writing. And I like this part of it, and here's how I would connect this to my own experience and my own views on writing. But this other part I don't think is right at all. And so you can say that. You can say both of those things, and you can get a lot of mileage out of that source by saying, this is a great start, but, or I agree with most of this, but maybe not so much this part. Or this is a great way to illustrate how this thing works. So, as we're evaluating sources, considering what to do with them, I want you to ask yourself 2 questions. First, why is this valuable for my argument? Again, be selfish here. And second, how can I respond to it in a way that improves my paper? What is this going to contribute to build in the argument? Remember the quote sandwich? Set up the quote, introduce it, give the quote and cite it, and respond to it in terms of your paper. I also want to touch here on the final exam. because this is one of the skills you'll be practicing on that test. Specifically, there are several questions where you will evaluate how and why an author uses specific kinds of sources, kind of what the effect is of using that particular quote. The best way to prepare for that is to go back through Tannen's article and look at every place where she references someone else, because she does that a lot, actually. She will cite, there's this study and that study, and this article says this, and here's the idea, but here's what I found in my work, and all this stuff kind of comes together for her argument. And we didn't really talk much about it in class, but it's a good example of using sources for different purposes. In particular, I want you to pay attention to the type of source that is cited. Is this an academic study? Is this a personal experience? Is this, so there's this blog post that I read. What kind of information is there? Is there number? Is there numbers? Are there numbers? I was an English professor. Is she reporting someone else's research findings? Is she recounting personal experience? You're saying kind of anecdotally, this is how I generally see my friends acting. Whether she seems to agree with a source or not. She may be using that to start off and saying, here's what others have said, but I'm going to take it in a different direction. And particularly how she uses that quote sandwich. What does she say before and after the quote? Because that'll give you a lot of information about her attitudes and her beliefs of the use of that particular content. As you're doing that, I want you to think of this as a conversation. You have the they say and the I say. The they say is what the source contributes. You may not ever actually talk to the person who wrote it, but in the context of your argument, what information or ideas or perspective is this source giving you? And how are you responding? How are you talking back to that source? If you can figure those stuff out, you'll be in a much better position to use sources effectively and not just try to drop them in and get on with the rest of your paper. All right, for this week's writing workshop, I'm going to recommend a couple of things. One of your other assignments is a mind map. And this one may take a little bit longer, probably not as long as the heuristics worksheet, because that was a big one. But it's another pre-writing exercise, similar to clustering, where you can brainstorm potential relationships. So there's a link there in the notes for software options to do free mind maps, or you can actually bring out paper, and if you want to use crayons, I suppose you use crayons, but work in whatever format you find helpful. You can use just words or pictures if you're more artistic than I am, which is probably all of you. But there's some good examples on MyFire and on the web. I'm not going to judge you on the artistic merit of your paper, because as long as you meet the goal of generating ideas and showing how this works, you're going to do fine. You're going to get the credit for the assignment. So if you're writing about philosophy of writing, I'm going to suggest that you start with, in the middle of the page, the word writing, and then circle it and decide what different areas might relate to that as well. If you don't feel like mind mapping, or if you've already done the mind map, you can use this time to find and read potential sources. I have a bibliography of potential sources up already on the announcements page on MyFire, I mentioned earlier. You are not limited to those sources, but they may give you a good starting point. This is also a place where talking to your classmates can be really helpful, because you're writing about similar topics, so you might be able to share sources. That's perfectly fine if there's overlap there. All right, that is all I have for you for today. You have finished up paper 2. That's probably the hardest one of the quarter. And we are moving on to finish strong with paper 3. Please start thinking about topics and structures, and then we can talk about those on an individual basis as you develop the ideas. See you next week.